All right, welcome back to the Crimson Flag podcast, where we bring you a class conscious analysis of historic and current events which are pertinent to the international working class movement. All right, so today is the third and final interview with Professor of Politics with East China Normal University in Shanghai, Joseph Gregory Mahoney. All right, so in the first half of the interview, we give some of our concluding thoughts as far as the Cultural Revolution. And in the second half of the interview, we go deeper into dialectical and historical materialism, as this is the method of analysis that Professor Mahoney has been using to study these events. So without further ado, here is our third and final part of our discussion on the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. All right, well, I'm back here with part 3 of my interview with Dr. Joseph Gregory Mahoney. We're going to be closing out our thoughts on the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, and some of the larger aims at the time. So I guess just to begin here, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions before you close out. My first question, I know that some of our listeners have been wanting to understand, your argument about the Cultural Revolution being being an event where Mao can better get the country to a place where it can later reform and open up. So here's my question. So a central part of the Cultural Revolution is the aim to remove those representatives of bourgeois thought from within the party, keeping China from heading down the quote unquote capitalist road. Because of this, many people see the later reform and later opening up as a sort of victory of the capitalist roaders who made it out of the Cultural Revolution. So can you explain why Mao attacked the capitalist roaders before beginning opening up himself?
Well, in the previous session, I was discussing the idea that, as a matter of tactics, he had to knock down the urban right before he risked disappointing the urban left with opening up to the United States. Now, I would not argue by necessity that Mao knew in 65 or 66 without a doubt that he would open to one or the other country. But I think it was, my argument is that he had an increasing understanding that it would be necessary to make peace with one and draw close to one, because they were failing to close the technology gap. And so I think what you see Mao doing as a strategic thinker, that he's positioning for having to change course, and he's going to have to open to one or the other. I do think, however, that he has a preference towards the United States, and that this preference starts to emerge in 1956, and it's relatively solid by 59. And so in the early 1960s, when we see these massive polemics against the Soviet Union coming out of Beijing, that the rupture is absolutely clear. And I gave, I think, a lot of arguments or evidence to support this, that Mao had seen the Soviets as a starting in the 1960s as a more immediate threat, that the Soviet Union would also fail over the long term. This was an assessment that Mao had expressed, and he said why, and I think if we look at the historical record, Mao's projection carries weight. In other words, the Soviet Union did stagnate because it did fail to ultimately to find the right mix between revolution and discipline in order to continue to advance Soviet interest on the global stage. So I think that when we enter the Cultural Revolution, it is a strategic it's part of an overall strategic vision that sees the necessity of opening up to one of the superpowers, with Mao's likely preference being the United States. And so it is in this um, context that I think that regardless of who he opens up to, whether the Soviet Union or the U.S., it's going to be politically risky for him. And you see this in Chinese leaders, right? Um, Before, and we see it again and again and again. One could say we see it in the Hundred Flowers campaign. Um, we see it when Xi Jinping takes power. The first thing he does is he goes out and he begins to discipline critics of the party, people who are taking pot shots at the party. Why? Because he's going to launch a massive anti-corruption campaign. In other words, he's going to be revealing all the dirt and all the corruption. He's sort of bloodletting the party itself, right? Exposing the party and making the party more vulnerable to criticism. And so, in order to go through this tremendous self-disciplining action, we must first knock down those people who will exploit that and take advantage of it and put us at greater risk. So I think that Mao Zedong, this is always a sort of calculation we see in Mao as a strategic thinker, and I think that when he launches the Cultural Revolution, he's got firstly the objective of taking class struggle in China to its endpoint as a tactic for emerging as a nation that can reach a threshold where it can then elevate class struggle to the international level. Now, the key point here is that despite all the rhetoric that we generally have about Mao Zedong and internationalism, which we I think sometimes romantically link to the old Marxist and Leninist notions of internationalism, I don't think they're the same thing, and rather, I think that we have to look at Mao as having solved the national problem, right? In other words, the Qing dynasty was unable to um, um, sustain and then reestablish sovereignty, and neither was the Kuomintang, the nationalists. And this is the biggest problem, right? This is the thing that people are most worried about. Can we survive and preserve China? And I think that if you want a specific value that is at the root of party legitimacy in Mao's time, but also today, it's whether or not the party can make a compelling argument that it has been a responsible steward of the national interest, right?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, did you save China? Did you put China on a development path? Did you? So all of these are more important even than theoretical notions of the peasantry versus the landlords, or the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. So in this sense, I think that class struggle is something that Mao Zedong is using in China in order to knock down these old social institutions that had been obstacles to modern nationhood, that
Okay.
had been holding China in old relations of production, an old mode of production that was and an old um, uh, incapacity to emerge as a modern nation that would then be capable of preserving itself in a world of competitive nation states.
Yeah, so I guess I just wonder, when he's making this capitalist rotor claim, I don't want to read too much into it or put my own words into it, but could it be that he's arguing that these are people who the end result of their policies could end in a restoration of capitalism in China, a fall of the Communist Party, something like this, just because their ideas and their prescriptions wouldn't help this nation building process? Is that kind of like why he's attacking these capitalist rotors? Is that the bigger point, that their policies aren't helping build this nation? Or
You know, so they're when you're looking at this history, um, there are things that people say in order to mobilize, in order to provoke, in order to um, advance your line.
mhm.
And there are things that you say because um, um, because you have constructed a narrative and you're working within a narrative. You have concepts, you have terminologies, and um, there's some things that you cannot escape saying.
Mm,
My point is, I don't think that that Mao has the same obsession with capitalism that we take him at his word for having. And I think what Mao is most concerned about is um, reestablishing a strong China, not a strong China that's capable of dominating its its international fellows, but rather that's capable of taking care of itself. And
mhm,
so the class struggle is something that is trying to knock down the old landlord culture, the old culture that kept the masses in a position where they were not really national citizens, they were not really national subjects, they weren't really part of um, the nation building project. And if you don't have that, if you don't have your 70%, or by some estimates, you're 90% engaged enthusiastically in the nation building project, then given the gap, right, the technology gap that exists, given the conflicts that you already have on the international stage, you have no ability to effectively resist. Okay, so there are sort of two class struggles at work. One is the class struggle that needs to take place within China in order to create a strong nation that could then, in turn, be better positioned to engage in class struggle at the international level. And so um, when we see Mao deploying class struggle, when we see him fixated on capitalist rotors, I think we have to understand what his objective is, right? It's not necessarily an ideological conflict with capital,
mhm.
although he's certainly not a friend of capital. It is rather a tactic that is aiming to draw the masses into modern nationhood, so that he can then, I think, position better in 68 and 69 for the struggle that he sees coming, the new struggle that he sees coming internationally, and the necessity of having to draw close to one of the superpowers, which is going to be politically difficult. So I think he's managing all of these processes.
Okay, yeah. It sounds like you're implying like there had to be a class struggle at home in order to get closer to this strong nationhood. And then when you have the strong nationhood, advance that class struggle to the international scene to an extent. Is
Right.
that kind of the basis of it for the most part?
I think so. And again, I think that the if we go back to the notion of antagonistic contradictions that we find in Mao's essay on contradiction, published in 1937, um, and his this what becomes sort of one of the founding documents of Chinese Marxism, and um, still to this day, um, um, the party going back to Mao's terminology and saying, okay, we need to focus on the primary contradiction, right? There are a multitude of contradictions, and some of these are antagonistic, and some of them are just part of life. But when it comes to the antagonistic contradictions, um, the types of contradictions that are used to oppress and exploit and to stymie progress, okay, then those are the ones where we need to engage. So, what is the primary contradiction in in um, um, 1937 or 1949? Um, um, in 37, it's the presence of Japan as an imperial power, um, slaughtering millions of Chinese. It's the fact that the future of China is very much in doubt. It's the fact that the Kuomintang, which is by far a larger and more powerful political organization than the communists, is aligned with relations of production and including landlords and the old warlords in a way that prevent the majority of Chinese from becoming part of the national project. And so, in order for us to deal um, more effectively with the external aggression, which, by the way, the whole reason for the Kuomintang, the whole justification for the Kuomintang was originally to solve the national problem, right? Because the Qing were unable to do this, and then the Kuomintang also failed to do this. Um, and so now, there are two contradictions at work with the Communist Party during the Civil War. We've got the antagonistic contradiction that exists because of the political alignment of the Kuomintang with these um, forces that are preventing China from progressing. And then we have also these external powers who are exploiting China's weakness. Um, so, you know, we need to resolve um, the problem of these systems, or the landlord versus the peasantry, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, although it's a very small part of China at that point. We need to resolve these things, um, and obviously resolve them in the form of the civil war between the communists and the Kuomintang, in order to solve the national question, in order to reestablish sovereignty, in order to build up the country, to create more social justice, to bring socialism, to eliminate poverty, uh, and to resist this external aggression that aims to enslave us or exploit us in one form or another.
Okay, right. And I'm glad you were talking about class struggle there. Um, because this is obviously a big piece of the Cultural Revolution. He's trying to mobilize the masses, and it's a more acute form of class struggle. A couple of things about it. I think your point on class struggle is important because it might help tie in better the Cultural Revolution to the reform and opening up. Because that is something that I can see as like a similar trend, which some people may disagree with, because we know that when the opening and reform time came, that China said, countries of, other countries, the class struggle is your business in your country. We're not going to be like the Comintern and do that sort of thing. But at the same time, we see opportunities for advancing class struggle through the reform and opening up. So I guess I think it's interesting because I know that Mao held class struggle continues under socialism, which a lot of communists agree with now for the most part. That wasn't so under the Soviet Union. They felt like they solved a lot of those contradictions and there wasn't as much as a class struggle under socialism. I guess, yeah, do you think that is maybe one of the things that could link the Cultural Revolution to the later opening up? I don't want to make it sound like, Mao had this plan the whole time. I think he, like you insinuated, he was trying to figure out who do I side with here, Soviet Union or the US. But at the same time, the class struggle was able to be brought to that international stage. So I think that's interesting. But I guess what I want to hear from you is China at the same time, like I mentioned, they use less class struggle type rhetoric once they open up to the world. Some people may see that as a contradiction, but like you said, rhetoric is used in very specific ways in politics. I would say there's not a contradiction there between, the reform and opening up, but I don't know. Do you have any particular thought from what I was talking about there?
Yeah, let me develop a few themes here, and the first thing is, to go back to the earlier session, as I said, Mao says that the Cultural Revolution comes to an end in 1968,
Right.
and I think that for the most part, class struggle as a mobilizing tactic, as a national transformation tactic, largely comes to an end at that point. There are a few little struggles and a few little things that are sort of legacy events that happen afterwards, but for the most part, it ends in '68, and so we jump from '68 to '74, right? And in '74, Deng Xiaoping is sent by Mao Zedong to give a speech at the United Nations, and Mao can't go because he's suffering from Parkinson's, we believe, but by most accounts, he writes the speech that Deng gives, and the speech introduces what to an international audience what becomes known as the three world theory. Mm-hmm. And I think if you read the three world theory, and I think, by the way, not enough attention is given to this concept, because I think that it remains very important to the Chinese Communist Party to this day. I think it was very important to Deng throughout his term in power. But he goes to New York and gives this speech. And I think that what we see is that the three world theory is taking the concept of class struggle and elevating it to that of the struggle of more developed nations that have been dominating and exploiting less developed nations. And I don't think there's any other way to interpret the three world theory. So a couple of interesting points here, right? The first is, too often we think of a radical rupture between Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping We think that in some way Deng is enemy number one or enemy number two after Liu Shaoqi, that he's the capitalist rotor. But in fact, Deng is in and out of power, and he's trusted enough by Mao to go to New York and to give this speech. And to go back, and I think I made this point in the earlier talk, that we see Mao repeatedly describing Deng Xiaoping in to foreign visitors and others who record these conversations, that Deng is the one who will remain. That Deng will be really the person who inherits the top position after the first generation dies. And so I think this leads us to really question, the whole rhetoric about, what is the meaning of class struggle, and the charge of the capitalist rotor, and this idea that Deng Xiaoping represents a great betrayal. Rather, it seems that Mao is setting the table. He's setting the table for the reforms that Deng Xiaoping will introduce, and he's actually, I think we have to argue, he's ensuring that Deng is preserved. If Deng was really posing the threat that we think that that this anti-capitalist rhetoric conveys, that he would have fallen. He would have died during the Cultural Revolution. And to support this argument, I think one of the things that we have to contend with is, and this is this came up in a lecture I was giving last night to a school of Marxism in China, a doctoral seminar, and I said, and it made some people angry, but I think about half the people agree with me, so I don't think it's that radical. But I think what we have to recognize as Marxists is that it is really Mao Zedong who paves the nationalist road in China. It is really Mao Zedong who creates a modern nation, who lays that foundation. And it's really Mao who then opens China up and begins to actively engage in positive but also in competitive ways the nation-state system. Now, if we go back to the old Marxist way of thinking, Marx makes it very clear that nationalism and capitalism are based on the same type of logic. They're based on the same type of values. In fact, we find the nation is really only a modern concept, right? It's something that arrives, that we see the sort of the proto-nation, the proto-modern nation emerging in England during the reign of Henry VIII, circa 1500, right? And we also see at that same time the beginnings of capitalism and Protestantism, like all these isms, right? The rise of what we later call, ego subjectivity on both the individual and the national level, and then what we will name, following Descartes, cogito subjectivity, right? This radicalization of the law of non-contradiction that follows in the wake of Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologica, published in 1274, which many epistemologists would argue is what creates sort of this intellectual opening for what becomes known as the Renaissance, and then the Enlightenment and modernity and the Industrial Age and all of these things. So all of this is a movement that is happening, and it is based on this same type of thinking. What we could say then is that by paving the nationalist road, this road in this global capitalist system, because even the Soviet Union is state capitalist at this point, right? So whether it's state capitalism or merely something in a private sphere, it's a global capitalist system. That China is through Mao is already advancing down the road, almost by necessity, right? He's laying the foundation. He's establishing this logic. He's establishing China in terms of its capacity to be a producer, consumer, and contributor to the global economy. Now, this is not to say that he valorizes capitalism or that he sees it teleologically as the desired endpoint of human development or Chinese development, but rather that it is something that is transitional, right? And Marx himself makes this point, right? We will go through capitalism because capitalism allows us to quickly advance technological development, to quickly accumulate technology and capital stocks, but also through this experience to transform the consciousness of people that will also be necessary for advancing society through socialism. So I see all of these as one thing leading to the other, and to a significant extent, that Mao is cognizant of this movement and positioning for it, not necessarily happily or normatively, but through historical material necessity.
Yeah, I'm glad you used the word necessity there. I was about to say, a lot of Marxism, this is where we differ than the anarchists. We say, well, looking through the dialectical historical materialist method, there are certain things that are a necessity. For example, most Marxists recognize that there needs to be a state of some form after a revolutionary movement. Now, I think most Marxists would agree that a state, it would be ideal if we lived in a world at the moment where we didn't need a state. That's the goal of communism, right? Um, but this building of a strong nation state that you're talking about, that too kind of sounds like a historical necessity for the conditions of China in order to consolidate a further revolution, towards socialism and communism. Um, but yeah, I think that was a really good point. I guess like my final question that I wanted to pose to you, when I was listening back and kind of taking in your argument, it brought something to my mind. I know that this is a common theme that you hear among people these days who talk about these issues. There's something called the late Mao theory, and you see it amongst the ultra leftists and sometimes the right opportunist type communists. So, for example, the ultra leftists, they'll say in Mao's later years, he began slipping in some areas. For example, reaching out to Nixon, opening up to the United States, they'll say that was a mistake of his old age. Kind of right opportunist communists, they tend to say the Cultural Revolution, yeah, it was this ultra leftist adventure. And well, Mao's a great guy, but he was just slipping in his old age. Can you talk about where that idea comes from? And of course, I think everything you presented kind of hints that is not true for the most part.
Well, I think that there's this tendency, and certainly the party would often lead others to believe that this was the case. But one of the key lessons you have to understand, I think, about the party is that no man is bigger than the party, and that was true in Mao's time, and it's true today. Um, um, Xi Jinping will stay in power as long as a majority of the party um, is convinced, um, and really a majority of the Chinese people, because the party is sensitive to this, that he's representing um, um, the best path forward. And so, you know, and I think the thing you have to remember is that even though the party is transformed during the Cultural Revolution, it is the party that Mao built. In other words, he built a party that was bigger than himself. And even though he has an outsized voice in it, um, um, this is, it's not him alone, okay? And this is true even in his later years. And as he doesn't just have a bunch of puppets who, in the standing committee, who are doing whatever he wants. Okay, things just don't work that way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the other point is as you see the right wing, and especially people in the West, um, generally speaking, I'm not talking about the leftist romantics who um, who have these sort of romantic notions attached to Mao Zedong. I find him completely unromantic, honestly. Um, but the in sort of this rightist, just to shorthand, um, this rightist interpretation, Mao is always evil, right? Communism is always evil, um, and whatever he did was wrong. And then you have sort of the ultra left who who wants to defend um, the Great Leap. They want in terms of in very narrow terms, right? And they want to defend um, uh, the Cultural Revolution now in very romantic terms. And some of these people are my friends. One of them I won't name by name, but uh, just to give you an insight into sort of his worldview, and he was someone who was a sent down youth during the CR, and um, um, but he at a conference at Peking University at Beida several years ago, he presented a paper where he was talking about how great North Korea is today.
Mm-hmm.
And um, this prompted derision and from the audience. And the audience was made up of primarily Chinese academics, but there was um, a number of foreigners in there as well. And they were very disrespectful to him, and I spoke up in the group and criticized them for being disrespectful in an academic forum, because the real point of his conversation, I think, was not to really talk about uh, what was great about North Korea, but to talk um, indirectly about what was bad about China with respect to reform and opening up,
Mm.
and the gross inequality that had begun to emerge because of the market economy, and including what we had seen in gender, the rise of gender inequality over the course of reform and opening up. And so, there was this, um, the audience didn't want to engage that, rather they really wanted to dodge that point and simply mock him for talking about North Korea. And for whatever reason, he didn't feel comfortable directly criticizing China. And so his tactic was to say something positive about someone else. Okay. But I know him well, and he's a friend. But I don't agree with a lot of what he says. I don't really have a position on North Korea. I don't really know much about it. But my sense is I would rather not live there, and I would rather not embrace that type of political system or economy. But that said, he makes this argument that you often hear on the ultra left or the ultra Maoist left, that it was Mao's intention that he would be succeeded by his estranged wife, Jiang Qing, who was, the leader of the Gang of Four.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that the historical record on this is really quite clear. That that the estrangement between Mao and his wife actually increases throughout the CR, and that in their private correspondence, he's often warning her that she's going to fall after he passes, because she doesn't really understand what she's doing. And then this raises the question: so who did, if not Jiang Qing, then who did Mao envision succeeding him, right? And Hua Guofeng argues initially and somewhat persuasively that he was Mao's intended successor. But I also think that this was not the case. I think Hua's number one qualification is that he was from Hunan, the same province as Mao Zedong. And if you have ever listened to recordings of Mao speaking, he has a heavy Hunanese accent. The Hunan Hua, the Hunan dialect, is unintelligible to many people who aren't familiar with it. And even when Mao was speaking Mandarin, you could still hear it. I remember years ago, for some reason, there were a lot of taxi drivers in Beijing. This is no longer the case, but there were a lot of, like in the 90s and 2000s, early 2000s, there were a lot of taxi drivers who were working in Beijing who were originally from Hunan. And I would get into a taxi and I would say, and you could tell that they were originally from rural areas in terms of the way, if you're familiar enough with Beijing style and culture and whatnot. And so I would ask them, what their hometown was, and they would always, like, I always knew what the answer would be. It was always Fulan, right? Because Fulan, this was the Hunanese way of saying Hunan. And so I think that Hua Guofeng's chief characteristic was that as Mao was suffering and in decline from what we believe to be Parkinson's, although this has never been officially confirmed by the Communist Party of China, that his voice was harder and harder to understand, realizing that it was already tinged with the Hunan accent to begin with. And so I think that Hua Guofeng was this useful proxy, because increasingly Mao wasn't going to meetings, but Hua was going on his behalf. But it wasn't just that Hua Guofeng was Hunanese and had a better ear for understanding Mao, but I think that his even bigger qualification is that he wasn't so politically capable, that Mao did not see him as a threat to Mao's power. In other words, that Mao could use him. And in fact, I think this is what's so sort of terminally limiting about Hua Guofeng, which Deng Xiaoping mocks with the two whatevers criticism, right? When Hua Guofeng says that we're going to say whatever Mao said and do whatever Mao did. Um,
Hmm.
that Hua has no sort of political genius beyond repeating and trying to do in some sort of narrow way what was done in the past. Um, but rather, Mao is uh, uh, a student of capability. He is a man of rare talent and genius, and he recognizes that in others. Um, and I think he recognized that in Deng Xiaoping, and he cultivated it, and he protected it, and he preserved it. And as he said many, many times, again and again to foreign visitors, Deng is the one who will be here after the rest of us are gone. So I I see that everything that we see actually transpiring during the CR actually conforms to a logic, actually conforms to a type of progress, a type of moving from the endpoint of the usefulness of class struggle as a national organization and liberation tool, reaching sort of an endpoint to that, so that one could then more effectively advance the same at the international level. And to keep in mind that Deng Xiaoping is the one who in 74 will go to the UN and give the speech that lays out, the three world theory, basically this idea of the class struggle at the international level. Um, and I think what's so interesting, of course, is that after Deng takes power, and so he's really starting to take power in 78, although Guo is still technically in charge. But you see um, that when the first volume of Deng Xiaoping's selected works come out, and then the second and the third, there's nothing in there from the 66 to 76 period. In other words, the party almost hides Deng's proactive involvement, um, and I think feeds this myth that exists that that Deng Xiaoping represents a radical rupture um, with Mao, and I don't think he does. I think that whether anybody likes it or not, and that includes Mao and Deng themselves, if we follow the sort of a dialectical materialist and historical materialist analysis, which has been the whole point
Hmm.
of my talk, um, one thing leads to the other. Mao's nation building project leads into the market society, leads into opening up, right? But this doesn't normatively say that anyone likes it or that anyone sees it as the desired endpoint.
Right. Yeah, I know. Just to address that there real quick, I believe on one of our past videos, we got something of a critical comment, um, where they said, okay, your argument sounds convincing, but they said, does that mean that you're falling into a great man type theory of history? But when I listen to your argument, I think it's kind of clear. You're not saying that Mao was planning everything and he had this 10-point plan just written out from the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. I think in our first episode, you did say he was setting the table, but he didn't know who would come. I think that's kind of a good analogy. And I think, if anything, that's not a historical deterministic point of view. Um, Instead, you're saying that he's looking at these contradictions, trying to find a resolution as he's moving forward. Um, but would you say that's probably a more fair, accurate description of what you're arguing, at least?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the key quote um, from from Marx on this point is, and I think it comes from the 18th Brumaire, if I recall correctly, um, that men make history, but never just as they please,
Yeah.
right? That um, that you have to struggle, um, but Marx intends this insight or this sort of aphorism uh, to carry several points. I mean, the first is the obvious that we wish we could uh, simply make things the way we want, but that's impossible to do, right?
Hmm.
But the other side of it is um, what we wish to be true right now is not necessarily the best thing because, and this is one of the reasons that Marx is very, except in his private notebooks, he very rarely um, discusses what communism will be like.
Hmm.
Um, he sometimes fantasizes about it in his notebooks, but in his published materials, he is very vague um, uh, to the point that Lenin, when Lenin is trying to figure out how to build, communism, he's left with reading the critique of the Gotha program, where he's trying to like read Marxist criticisms backward. Okay, so if Marx is criticizing this, then maybe that suggests that he valued um, that maybe that there's an implicit value. Okay, so by criticizing this one thing, maybe he's actually revealing what he values. But Marx's point was that that socialism and communism will be built by people who are more advanced than he is, and more advanced in two senses of the word, right? And these two senses that will, these two aspects that will go hand in hand together. One is the material world will be transformed and more advanced in ways that I, sitting in my position now, cannot and should not imagine,
Hmm.
right? It's impossible to imagine. But as a materialist, why would I sit here and tell you what the advanced technology of the future is going to be, and then tell you how you're going to use that to construct socialism, right? And then secondly, that our consciousness, that our critical consciousness, right, will be more advanced, and the way we understand, the way we recognize and create justice will be superior to what Marx himself is capable. And if you need um, sort of any, as a Marxist today, if you need any compelling evidence of that, we can look back and see that Marx himself was was you know far inferior to Engels as in terms of feminism. In fact, Marx, aside from his very positive and cultivating relationship with his daughter, it wouldn't be wrong to call him a misogynist, right? Um, and similarly, um, there's some evidence that um, he did not have the most progressive position on homosexuality, right? But as a Marxist today, um, with a more advanced social consciousness, we understand, and even Mao Zedong understood, there's no socialism without women's liberation. And I think
Yeah.
increasingly we understand that there's no socialism without sexual liberation. Not sexual liberation in the sense that we all become victims of sexual fetishism
Hmm.
as a form of commodity fetishism, but rather um, that the categories of sex are not oppressive categories that are used to stymie and limit certain populations um, in ways that run contrary to um, real human being and um, a scientific understanding of the human experience.
Yeah, yeah, right, right. I think that's a pretty solid point about history. I mean, yeah, as communists we have these goals, but I think that's where a lot of people get distracted because we have these higher aims, but it's a matter of reaching them and what we'll have to go through to get there. So that is important. But I know that you had some comments that you wanted to throw out, like just to kind of like wrap up the series and everything. Was there any specific points that you wanted to make before we finish this out here, or?
Yeah, I think there are 3 or 4 points, and I'll try to. I don't want to develop them at length because it would end up being too academic. And I've written about them in other places, and if people want to, Google that or Baidu it, that's fine. Some of the publications are in Chinese. Um, I don't. I can't remember if I mentioned. Maybe you can remind me that I had published a paper in one of the party journals, party-affiliated journals. I can't remember if the paper came out in 2018 or 2019, but I wrote it in 2018, the 200th anniversary of Marx's birth, and it was the paper was Marxism's three big gifts to China. Did I mention this before?
No, you have not.
Yeah. Okay. So in that paper, I said that the three big gifts, because we had all these events in 2018 commemorating the 200th anniversary of Marx's birth in China, and so I was invited to give a lot of talks, and one of these then got published. And I said that the three big contributions to China. First, dialectical materialism. How could China take this sort of yin yang thought and build this epistemological bridge to materialism, but also the linear analytical side that was not very well developed, or at least not as well developed in China as it was in the West, and that was instrumental in constructing things like nationalism and industrialism and let's face it, capitalism. Right? I mean, and this is what Marx is saying. It's the absence, in part. When Marx discovers the materialist dialectic, and this is a very sort of I'm going to try to say this in a very clear way, but if you really want to understand the materialist dialectic, you go back to the afterword to the second German edition, where so many Marxists are familiar with this, of Capital Volume 1, where he's describing his method, and he has that very famous phrase where he says, you have to take Hegel and turn him upside down, right? In other words, connect the idea to the ground, right? And those ground the idea in the material reality. And if we go back and we look at Marx, the early Marx, I think that we have this periodization of Marxism that prevails in the West that is often a little misguided. We have generally two periods, what is known as the early versus the mature.
That's
And
a quick comment. I know that's a common thing amongst Marxist academics. I know that sometimes that tends to get ridiculed, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it should be ridiculed, and and one could ridicule me for what I'm about to say, which is, at the very least, we should see three periods. There's sort of an early period, and then there's a transitional period, and then there's kind of like in that transitional period, we can see sort of different things at work, and then there's a third period. But the first period, the most famous work, the Philosophic and Economic Manuscripts of 1844, and there we can see a critical attitude towards Hegel, but we can also really see a lot of the Hegelian idealism at work. Okay, now the point that I would make is that even though we have these three distinct periods, they don't necessarily negate. So when you see someone like Althusser says anything before capital, essentially you should ignore before Capital Volume 1. And I totally disagree with this. I think that you can see Marx's development, and you can see his struggle, and this is informative. But underneath all of that, you can actually see what he cares about, right? And I think he still cares about these same things. He still has these motives for social justice that we see in the early text. That's still driving him in the later work. He just doesn't. Um, he's not as effusive about it. He's more focused on analyzing things in what he would describe as more scientific ways. So we see, nevertheless, we do see this early period where he has this very strong um, uh, uh, Hegelian idealist perspective. And then starting with the theses on Feuerbach, right, which is what, 1845, leading into the German ideology, um, we see this new appreciation for materialism, right? Where he's really going to start to distinguish himself much more clearly from Hegelian idealism. Okay, and for many, so not the Althusserian school, which starts with mature Marx at Capital Volume One, but for the other academic Marxists, the theses on Feuerbach is the starting point of the mature Marx, and this is, I think, really important for them because they want to ensure that the Communist Manifesto is in that mature Marx period. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's really what they're trying to preserve. But you know, I would say that this leads them to overvalue um, the German ideology and sort of a deterministic concept of the relationship of consciousness to material reality that I don't think is really that strongly asserted in the later Marx. And I don't think Marx feels like he has to go back and correct the German ideology or that position because that book was never published in Marx's time. In other words, he doesn't have to repudiate a thesis that he didn't actually publish. Um, and so I think that this leads a lot of Marxists to take this very deterministic view about consciousness as coming solely from the material economic forces. In fact, someone criticized me of this last night, and the point is, if that's the case, then how can you form critical consciousness? How can you begin to articulate a revolutionary praxis if you're not able to conceptualize a theoretical alternative and then begin to work to transform the material reality? You would end up in a closed loop and no real progress would be possible. But the interesting thing, the interesting criticism, there are two interesting criticisms to make of the Communist Manifesto. Um, the first is one of the most famous lines in the manifesto is capitalism creates its own gravediggers.
Right.
And this is, I think it was Kohev or Jean Hippolyte, I can't remember which of the two, but both of them were very interested in Hegel's relationship to Marx. But this idea that capitalism creates its own gravediggers is almost verbatim a um, a not verbatim, but it's conceptually completely faithful to um, uh, the master-slave dialectic in Hegel. So Hegel's influence in the manifesto is still extremely pervasive.
Right,
And
because Hegel is it because he's arguing that the slave master relationship leads to the slave eventually taking over or breaking out of that? Is that the argument there?
Yes, but in the master-slave dialectic, without wanting to slip into a lecture on that,
Yeah.
although it's a favorite, it's a favorite topic of mine. What makes the master-slave dialectic, and this is in the Phenomenology of Spirit and in the Oxford edition, it's translated as Lord and Bondsman, but and usually we refer to it as the master-slave dialectic. But in that discussion, um, we can see precisely the idealist dialectic at work in Hegel, because what Hegel is describing is the dialectical development of consciousness. Okay, so and he's talking about um, that the slave has sort of um, an opportunity, because there's a type of double dialectic at work. Um, there's the dialectic of the conflict with the master, but then there's the dialectic of the slave who has to struggle with creative work, right? And those by struggling to um, um, make the things that the master needs, the slave is actually advancing and developing his consciousness. And this is what allows him to eventually surpass the capacity of the master, who doesn't enjoy the same challenges and the same opportunities for growth, and becomes stagnant in his consciousness. Right? And of course, Hegel isn't just talking about, he's talking about, there are generally three interpretations. One is um, um, the development of the consciousness, or what we call harmonization, that generationally we have over time humanity rising to higher and higher levels of consciousness, but through a dialectical struggle with the older ways of thinking, right? There's this sort of a generational struggle, new ideas versus the old, moving towards a progressive advance. So that's one sense. The second sense is um, the struggle to develop your own consciousness inside your own head. In other words, you have old ideas in your own head, and these begin to struggle with new ideas and new insights. And if that struggle is conducted well, if you're actually moving forward, then you sublate. You have the old ideas are transformed, and the new ones become dominant, right? And I think we can all relate to that in terms of our own lived experience, that we've sometimes struggled with new concepts and new ideas, and had to, and especially if we're talking about socialists or communists who grew up in the United States, probably you didn't come out of the womb, or you probably didn't have parents who taught you how to be good communists. That was a struggle to reach that point, where you embrace that. So, and then the third interpretation is the actual struggle between um, people who are being oppressed. Um, and in this sense, it's often said that Hegel's master-slave dialectic was inspired by the Haitian slave revolt. Um, but all of this is really idealism, because it's about the development of the consciousness in struggles of itself, in a sense. Okay,
Hmm.
uh, and I think we can still see that influence powerfully in the Communist Manifesto. And then the second main critique of the manifesto is that it was published in early 1848, ahead of the revolutions of 48, and then the revolutions of 48 all fail. Um, and in many cases, aside from some of the unique things that happen in Scandinavia, where you have a moderated um, the beginnings of Scandinavian socialism are part of the settlement that is reached between competing forces, neither one able to win outright in 48 in Denmark and Sweden and whatnot. That's where the roots of Scandinavian socialism come from. But in the rest of Europe, it fails. And where does it get closest? It gets closest in France. And so then Marx then says, okay, I'm going to study why it failed in France. And then he begins his historical studies.
Right.
And then, as he's going through the historical studies, he slowly starts to realize that he needs to put more and more emphasis on it's really historical. We should say historical political. His focus is on the political. Why did this form of politics prevail over that form of politics, right? And this is where he's writing the 18th Brumaire and the other works on France, and he's starting to realize that underneath all of this is the dominant position of economic relations.
Oh, right, right.
And so that's when he's going to start, in the late 1850s and then 1860, late 1850s, 1850s, he starts focusing all of his energy on studying economics. And then in the late 1850s, he starts searching for a method. Like, what is the critical method that I'm going to be able to use to organize my critique of capital, right? And one way to look at it is anyone except Hegel, right? Because he was so disillusioned with Hegel. And the last person that he really flirts with trying to find a method is Spinoza. He spends a long time thinking about Spinoza and how he might derive a critical method from Spinoza, and then he comes back to Hegel, right? And this is the key insight that what Hegel does is Hegel studies. Hegel's provoked by Kant, and Kant writes the Critique of Pure Reason, and he says there's the analytic and the dialectic, and other works in Kant's lectures on logic. He derides dialectics as metaphysical juggling, as the logic of illusion, right? And this analytical sort of linear logic based on Aristotle's law of non-contradiction is logic, right? It is what is sensible and rational. And this provokes Hegel to then to begin to wonder, why is it, is Kant right? And he comes to the conclusion that Kant is right to criticize the dialectic as it had developed in the West, because we didn't develop it well. And that's when Hegel then gets into this long study of the history of philosophy, and he goes all the way back, and he basically concludes that there's this huge missing chunk of the history of ideas in the West, and that's related to dialectic. So then he begins to construct, from what's missing from the world of ideas is a dialectical understanding. So he then begins to develop this. And then this, of course, is influential on the early Marx. But then what the later Marx discovers as he's studying the material world, right? As he's studying competitive capitalism, competitive nation-state system, is that these systems exist because the dialectic, in part, has been excluded, has been so marginalized and delegitimized and removed from consciousness, right? That this is really the history of ideas of the development of modern Europe. As a result, the dialectical perspective is completely outside of the prevailing way of thinking, and therefore it provides a critical perspective, right? And once we begin to use that critical perspective, we can begin to see the contradictions that capitalism is always trying to hide. We can see the metaphysics that capitalism is trying to posit as scientific fact. And so, in this sense, we begin to understand that the dialectical materialism, as it becomes called later, is something that Marx is described as discovering. He discovers what happens in the material world when the dialectical perspective is absent, right? And so then when we bring that dialectical perspective to it, we begin to understand something about the material world, how it actually developed, and how we can take it further.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, I think that's interesting because you described it as like three periods. I think it's obvious there are differences in Marx's focus, through these different periods of his life. But I think you're totally right that although there are these differences, they aren't like repudiations of each period. He's not totally like getting rid of all his past ideas, even though he's advancing forward in his perspective and stuff. You were talking about like the slave dialectic and such. I guess, I'm wondering something because I know later on, Marx's argument, it isn't that because the proletariat are exploited, they are going to have a revolution. Like there have been plenty of classes in past societies who have been oppressed in like horrible ways, but that doesn't necessarily lead to revolution. So like, yeah, the development of consciousness is important, but also just your situation and your particular time of history. Like, can this class take power? Is that where the contradiction is headed, or are they going to become something different? But when you were talking about the slave dialectic there, I'm trying to kind of grasp like your meaning. Were you saying like Marx later on, like he totally changed like his way of viewing this dialectic and such, where in the beginning he was kind of following the more Hegelian tradition?
Well, let's make sure we have the right term, the master slave, hyphenated
Right.
master slave dialectic. Um, this is a question that really haunts the 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 early Western Marxists, right? People like George Lukács, um, especially, and his book History of Class Consciousness, right? Because the question that these Western Marxists who are emerging in Europe, distinct from Soviet Marxism, is why, and this is the provocation that comes from Lenin. Why does the communist revolution start in Russia? If we're really following Marx, it should have started in
Germany or something along. Yeah.
the UK or the United States even, and the and they're asking this question for two reasons. One, why didn't it? And two, what do we got to do in order to get it moving? Okay. In other words, why haven't the workers um, proceeded with socialism? And some people would say, well, actually, um, there was an incremental socialism um, through labor parties, through various forms of progressive politics that were alleviating some of the worst excesses of um, capitalism. So it was not so much a revolutionary change, but an evolutionary change. That's one argument. Um, Lenin's argument is that these capitalist nations are at the center of the global system, and they are exploiting the periphery, and this can supplement. So, in a sort of corporate sense, even workers in the United States and the UK get some sort of benefit from being able to exploit workers in other countries, right? Because as the nation benefits, as the nation is able to assert all sorts of advantages, they benefit from these in part, but also they benefit from higher security, but they also benefit from being able to purchase low-cost goods, right? And we can see this if you need sort of a contemporary example. The majority of products that you buy at Walmart are manufactured overseas, most of them in China. And there are all sorts of estimates that whatever the social cost of Walmart are, and they are quite high in the United States, that workers get some economic benefit from being able to buy cheap products. And that cost is being borne substantially by the exploited workers in the countries where those products are being made. So that's another argument, but the the in my view, I think Lenin's argument is more compelling, and I think that we're in the midst of a sort of double revolution right now, globally, and the revolution, and I use that word probably too casually, but the one revolution is the rise of Asia, where we're seeing pushing back against all still existing systems. I mean, I remember something that the French president Macron said when Biden went to Europe recently to promote this awkward term, what B3W, Build Back a Better World, where we're gonna the United States wants to propose this as a competitor with China's Belt and Road Initiative, and Macron says, "Why don't you just reform the international institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, that are continuing to exploit the developing world? Why don't we start with that instead of trying to, build a massive system that we can't actually afford and that probably won't succeed to compete with this development paradigm that Beijing is promoting." And if we look at the one of the big banks associated with BRI, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB in Beijing, with China as the number one shareholder, and the number two shareholder is India, and then the United States was trying to pressure all the European and other country American allies to not join the bank. And I think the UK was the first to break and join the bank. But the big reason for the AIIB is that the ADB, the Asian Development Bank, which is controlled by Japan and the United States, was restricting development projects that favored development that might in Asia that might have put those countries in a better competitive position vis-a-vis Japan or the United States. So we see this, and lots of people talk about the rise of Asia and this, this realignment of global power. That's one revolution that's ongoing. But the second revolution that's ongoing is, what we're seeing somewhat tepidly, but nevertheless, in the United States and perhaps some other developing countries, where really one could say since the 1970s, but accelerating in the 1980s, where we begin to see a decline in real wages, We see various crises that continuously knock back um, the working class, where the working class loses their savings, their pensions, where they're disciplined, where they have to start, or they lose their jobs and they have to accept um, discipline. Um, but then, really this accelerating from 2008, where so many lost their homes, where they lost their pensions. Um, and this then begins to intersect with the opioid crisis. We begin to see the United States is the only developed country in the world where middle-aged white men are committing suicide at increasing rates. Um, and Trump comes in and he exploits this, right?
Yeah.
He is able to exploit it. In fact, in ways that the closest analog would be Bernie Sanders in some sense. Um, Anti-free trade. He's really following this populistic logic. Um, because and really it was really only Sanders and Trump that were engaging um, people in a in sort of a deeply meaningful way in that
Yeah.
in that election
I think
where
that's fair.
yeah um, but there is a revolution where and the key point here is that um, we still have American workers who are uh, enjoying the corporate benefit of being Americans, right? Um, in so much as, for example, um, the power of the US dollar as a supranational currency. Keep in mind that last year, the money supply, the Treasury increased the money supply by 20% in order to cover the mess of COVID, in order to cover the economic, what was really an economic collapse. And keep in mind, in 2008, at the height of the global financial crisis, they simply created digitally $1 trillion one night, right?
Hmm.
Uh, to maintain liquidity to prevent fictionally create $1 trillion so that the system doesn't collapse. If we're looking at this in real terms, the system did collapse.
Yeah.
And and it's been in a slow, it's been in a managed collapse.
Yeah, like
Uh,
almost like band-aids. Like we're putting band-aids on it, but it's still, the collapse is still happening.
well, the collapse is still happening, and we see it manifest in material form in terms of what we saw last year with the public health, but also economic response, and the trillions of dollars that they're trying to throw into the economy now to prop it up and keep it going. Um, um, and they're not even able, the Democrats can't even come to terms on that right now. So I don't know, where that's headed. Apparently Trump is licking his chops and thinks that there's going to be some incredible nostalgia for him for the next run. I think he's delusional. I think the best thing that could happen to Democrats is that Trump runs and divides the party. Only the worst ass end of the Republican Party would support him. Um, I think he's done. But um, uh, and I think all the sequencing we see in Congress for hearings and the trials that will be advancing in New York will ensure that he's no longer politically viable, uh, which may be a tactical error on the Democrats' part if they can't get their own shit together.
Hmm.
But this brings me back to that we are in the midst of this second revolution, where American workers are no longer enjoying the capacity of the center to exploit the periphery the way it once did.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, right, we're coming back to this future that Marx envisioned, where you know workers the world over would find that they were confronting the same problems. And so I think this creates this opening, this new opening for the advancement of class consciousness in places like the United States, which is really something that activists and educators and other well-meaning people need to reflect on. Sort of the historical moment
Hmm.
of now, right? I mean, revolutions and progress don't just happen. They're not just predetermined, right? You actually have to go out and struggle um, and suffer.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a couple of points that I want to make in response to that. What you're describing generally has been termed like the fall of the labor aristocracy. That's a Leninist term. It's what you were describing, the workers of the imperial countries gaining these benefits. Essentially, their ruling class helping buy them off to keep them from possibly doing a revolution of some sort. I know that even I was reading a biography of Cecil Rhodes, and very famous British colonialist. He has a quote where um, he said, "I decided that I would bring the system of imperialism to the UK when I saw the conditions of the working class," which is very weird because his whole argument was, look, the working class in Britain is pretty destitute. They are going to either have a civil war or a revolution or something. So through imperialism, we can create this labor aristocracy and, keep them from doing that. Look, that's a communist kind of theory, but it's very interesting to hear it from a actual imperialists themselves, put it that way. Um, but what you're talking about, America being in this decline. Look, this is a kind of a big debate amongst the communist YouTube people, at least. Um, some hold that because there is a labor aristocracy in the Western countries, we are unlikely to see revolutions in any way, shape, or form. I obviously disagree with this. I think that the labor aristocracy can provide that effect on the working class for sure. But I think you hit the nail on the head because the key piece here is yes, even though we have a labor aristocracy in the West, their privileged position is now threatened. And as communists, we need to really utilize that opportunity because otherwise fascist kind of forces might utilize that opportunity and say, you know, um, with their populist rhetoric, they can get in there. But I do think that that is kind of the key, one of the key pieces of our current time period, at least in America, is that this labor aristocracy, who is very privileged, is not going to be seeing those privileges or that convenience that they so love, in their near future, possibly. Um, but yeah, I think, like you said, that does give a lot of opportunity for furthering class struggle in America if communists can wake up to this opportunity.
Well, the I think that I don't like the term labor aristocracy. I just stick with the other uh, center versus periphery and
Hmm.
um, term. But yeah, if we use labor aristocracy, I think it's been hollowed out now. I think American workers still enjoy some key advantages, and to reiterate, I think the biggest of these is the U.S. dollar and the fact that the U.S. government can basically, you know, push its pain out onto the world. Why are we, you know, what is the worst, most regressive tax at all? It's inflation due to an oversupply of money. What do we have in the United States right now? We have this incredible regressive tax on workers because inflation is outpacing um, um, wages and salaries, which were already in a period of relative decline. Um, but the general trend, and everyone agrees that this is coming sooner or later. There's a lot of debate about how soon, is that the dollar is going to end as the global supranational currency. The EU, the euro was actually envisioned as a competitor to the dollar, and it did not manage to really to displace the dollar.
Right.
or to push it back enough. Um, but I think what you see with what China is doing now, in terms of clearing accounts, in terms of the digital yuan, um, um, that that increasingly countries are managing to do business without the dollar, and that's the trend. And sooner or later, the U.S. is going to lose that powerful tool to be able to externalize its mismanagement, um, economic mismanagement at home, to cover up the exploitation of labor, and to deal, with band-aid approaches to crises. This capacity is in decline, serious decline, and so I that's coming. I think we're already seeing the end of that. The world is wise to it,
Hmm.
and by the way, China really drew a lot of lessons from how the U.S. handled '08, um,
Mm.
and it really redoubled China's efforts to find a solution to the dollar, um, because as long as the U.S. was able to maintain the dollar, it would be able to perpetuate the fiction of, of American power. Um,
Yeah, I could see the 2008 crisis waking them up. I think that's a good argument.
well,
Uh,
what you really see after '08, and this is a separate topic, is the normalization of building in Chinese theory and practice, the acceptance and normalization of building what China calls an effective regime of macro controls for managing the economy, which the United States now attacks as this socialistic or communistic intervention in markets, but that's precisely what the U.S. does, but in a completely reactionary way, as we see in '08 and then last year. Um, but the to go back to your earlier point, the immediate danger is fascism, and you have several leading leftist scholars who are concerned that fascism is the more likely um, um, next step in in um, in U.S. political development, and whether it's you know a very clear-cut fascism, someone like a Mussolini or a Hitler who's able to seize power and impose a certain, or whether it's just a growing uh, fascism in the hearts and minds of a certain majority, um, that's able to impose its will on the rest of the nation. Uh, Either way, um, this this is one of the more compelling dangers, um, that many people are concerned about. Um, in my perspective, it's a real concern, um, and we all might fall from it. Um, so I don't want to say don't worry about it,
yeah.
and I do want to say organize against it. However, from the long view of history, and not the longue durée, as expressed by Fernand Braudel, but from the dialectical and historical materialist view of history, um, fascism is self-limiting.
Mm.
It is not capable of progress.
Oh, right. Yeah, because it's inherently reactionary, and it tends to manifest when the capitalist state is either in decline or facing some serious issues. So I could see that.
Right. My my something that I wrote in an article recently, that some people liked, and so I'm patting myself on the back, forgive me, is that evil is self-limiting.
Hmm.
And you look at everything that, for example, that Hitler did, most of it was self-limiting. You know, you basically go to war with yourself. You go to war with everyone else. What's the end game? Um, how does all that destruction lead to something better? Um, it doesn't. It leads to complete destruction, and that's a simplistic expression of it. But ultimately, if you're not moving forward in a way that is moving other people forward, um, moving the masses forward, then it's not sustainable. So, and whether we view that through the lens of climate change, which, by the way, cannot accommodate climate. The need to deal with climate change cannot accommodate fascism. Uh,
Right.
Fascism promotes ultimately conflict between nations, and that is contrary to the needed international response to climate change. So forth and so on. So either we move forward socialistically, or we don't. I think, and I think that this is Marx's conclusion that the only logical way to solve the contradictions that we face is to work together in a way that saves and preserves as many people as possible. Um, and if we're not doing that, then we're doomed. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of a scary road because it seems like when there's a potential for fascism or socialism, I mean, it isn't always this way, but because both of them utilize the masses and utilize populist rhetoric, it seems like you could easily go down those two roads. Like in Germany, I mean, they had a massive communist party right before fascism took over, but look what happened. So yeah, hopefully that doesn't lead that way, but we'll have to see for sure. Um, but I just want to say one last thing before we close out. I know you were talking about the potential fall of the U.S. dollar. That has been very interesting to me as well. I will say to everybody that we released an episode last year. If you look back on our channel, that kind of talks about the U.S. dollar and its potential for the future, or lack of potential, maybe we should say. Um, but yeah, and I think we covered the Cultural Revolution really good. I'm glad we could get into some of the deeper philosophy and stuff as well. But I guess just before we close out of here, I don't know if you had any final comments to make or anything. I guess like real quick, I'll just say that I think your analysis. I like how you phrase the Cultural Revolution, at least your thesis, as you put it. You're presenting a thesis that you have gained by using the dialectical materialist method. And a lot of times on YouTube, I feel like communists, when they make these videos, they almost have this attitude of, okay, I researched this and this is true, so I'm making an argument why all you out there should believe this too. But from your argument, I'm not really hearing that as much. It does feel very academic in a good way, that it's saying, look, this is what the conclusion is if we use this method, and deal with the theses from there. Critique it from there and see if you think of something better. But so in that way, I guess I appreciate your analysis. But yeah, did you have any final words that you wanted to give before you close this out here?
yeah,
Or
I guess a few points, and I can talk all day, so I'll try not to do that. But
you good?
the first point is, if we go back and we look at Mao and what he's saying about history and historical development, and the way that he's trying to develop China, he's always looking at this history through the lens of dialectical and historical materialism. And as he's making policies, he's projecting dialectical and historical materialism. And as Marxists, right, this leads us to this provocative point where shouldn't we from the dialectical and historical materialist position, we shouldn't overemphasize what one man says at one point in time,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
I mean, it's really contrary to what we think of in terms of dialectical. In other words, here's someone who says, uh, who privileges dialectical and historical materialism as a mode of analysis, and in his policy making. And we could argue that the communists who come after him do the same thing. And yet, for whatever reason, as Marxists, we don't actually analyze that period of time from a dialectical and historical materialist position. In fact, we get sucked into the ego politics of, well, what did Mao say
Yeah.
versus what did Deng say? Well, why don't we look at what they actually did and struggled and what came of what happened? And that was set aside the personalities, set aside the romance, and focus on what actually happened. How did they actually move from being one of the most backward countries to the number 2 country in the world right now? How did they close the technology gap? A friend of mine, and I can't cite this study because it's being published in the next week or so, so it's still embargoed, but they just did this massive study where they looked at which countries in the world right now have technological independence versus which ones are dependent. And only 3 countries in the world right now have technological independence. Number 1, the United States. Number 2, South Korea. Number 3, China. Okay? And this is a complete reversal, a complete material reversal, right? If you go back to the 1940s, even the 1950s, all the way up to the early 1960s, China is the biggest problem, right? Going all the way back to the opium wars, the biggest problem is the technology gap.
Mm-hmm.
This is what leaves China vulnerable to foreign aggression. Why is it that a small power like the UK can impose its will? Why is it that a small country like Japan can impose its will on China? Because they have this incredible advantage in technology. And technology, I'm not going to get into a lecture on, but it's not just you have a superior gun, but you have a superior organization, you have superior capacities to communicate, to assess information, so forth and so on. So that we've seen this complete material reversal. How did they actually do that? Okay. How did they actually struggle and survive class struggle at the international level since the late 1960s, which is what they have done? How is it that Xi Jinping has now reached a point in time where he says we are now in a new era? Okay, we are now in an era where we're no longer, and he's basically said this. I'm not quoting him verbatim, but we're no longer just going to do what the United States says. We're no longer going to allow the U.S. to bully us. We're going to resist. Okay. Now, this has been read in the West and by the U.S. in particular as China being aggressive. And China says, no, we're resisting your aggression, and you're reading that as aggression, right?
Like U.S. aggression has been so normalized, they're considered aggressive for daring to say, "Hey, how about we don't do that?"
Right. And I don't want to get into a longer analysis of the role that the Diaoyu Islands or the South China Sea or all these things play in this. But this leads me to a point, and that is, I don't think the Chinese system is a danger to the world. I don't think that you see all this, Cold War rhetoric coming out of Washington that the Chinese communists want to rule the world, that they have a scheme to displace the United States and to rule the world. And I think that this is so laughable from the Chinese communist perspective, because the Chinese communist system is not portable. It only works in China. And by the way, it does not even work as well as they want in China.
Mm.
There are natural limits to that system, and they're never satisfied with even how well it works in China. And once you start going beyond China, it doesn't work at all. Now there may be little cells or groups that, you know, but they pose no real risk or political legitimacy or capacity outside of China. But that said, I advanced a thesis earlier this year um, that that China that the Chinese political system is inherently crisis seeking. All
Mm.
right. In other words, that in part this is inspired by their still privileging of dialectics and focusing on what some people call the principal contradiction or the primary contradiction as it's translated. But this idea that you must run towards problems. Now,
Mm.
some problems you can't fix, some problems you can't address, some problems are outside of your range, and some are secondary, right? But this perpetual movement towards identifying problems and including problems within the party itself, right? So how do we change? How do we solve antagonistic contradictions, whether it's the party organization with corruption or state, the state apparatus, or how we organize the military apparatus, or how we organize the industrial system. How I mean, if you look at the incredible advances made in China now, with what I think is fairly called a green revolution, is China still producing more CO2 than any other country? Yes. More per capita than the U.S.? No. More historically than the U.S.? No. Is it unfair that China um, uh, uh, is at the final stage of its national development, um, and it has to pay a disproportionate cost for the developing world having screwed up the global environment beforehand? Um, Whatever, right? But the bottom line is you see this sort of progressive movement towards resolving crises, and I don't see that happening um, in the West. But that creates this perception that China wants the crisis with the West, right? In other words, that as the West is unable to resolve its problems, as it's unable to reform and move past, its labor aristocracy or the old privileges it enjoyed as, at the center, which
Mm.
have been eroded. Um, that the crisis is now the crisis of a rising China, and I really don't think the people in Beijing see it that way. Uh, in fact, I would argue that China is still too isolationist
Mm.
and too Chinese exceptional um, in their worldview, that they need to be even more positively engaged, um, and taking an even stronger role in pushing back against hegemony than they already are. Um, but
Yeah.
I don't see them as an international threat, but I do see the West trying to portray them, particularly the United States, trying to portray them as an international threat, and then mobilize against it, which is a threat in and of itself.
Right, right. Yeah, and that's very different. I think it's interesting because last point you said China's not trying to export its system, and I think that's very clear, especially if you look at their actions and or read their writings. I do think it's interesting though because I read a book recently, "The China Wave" by Zhang Weiwei, and he talks in depth about that, how China doesn't want to export its system, but at the same time, he does talk about how the future problems that are probably going to come in this century, require certain methods of government that maybe the Chinese are beginning to perfect or beginning to test now, and that we may see certain features of this in other governments that deal with large problems as this century continues. He even mentions, I think, like pandemics. And this is written in like last decade. But I think that's the main thing, is that China is not aggressively pushing its system out to the world, but it's but almost leading by example. I don't know if that's a poor way of phrasing it, but through its actions, it's able to show the benefits of its system. But I guess that's just kind of my analysis at the very least.
I wrote a piece that was published last week, I think, in Beijing Review. No, it was published by CGTN, called "The Principles of Chinese Democracy," and I was, I was being somewhat intentionally provocative. Sometimes I'm a little polemical and a little less academic, and I enjoy it, but more than I should.
It's a Marxist tradition.
It's a, it's a, I don't know, but the thing is, um, you know, if the party does not, and we know that by most assessments, popular support in China for the central government varies somewhere between 70 to up to the mid 80% range.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and critics would say, well, and these are from Pew Global Research Polls. So critics would say, well, maybe it's not an accurate reflection. Uh, that argument's not very strong. Or they say, well, it's because the Chinese government is so effective at restricting information and propaganda. Not really. That's not really the case. In fact, I find that most Chinese that I speak with, assuming that most Chinese are like a lot of other people in the world, they don't really care that much about politics at all. They're thinking about more immediate concerns, and
Mm-hmm.
they would rather not think about politics. But what I'm constantly surprised about is how informed a lot of people really are.
Mm.
Um, and at the same time, how this is, you have to say this in today's age, how less misinformed
Mm.
a lot of people are,
It's important.
right? Because we have a lot of people who are misinformed in this country right now because of fake news and deliberate attempts to spread lies and to promote alternate realities. Um, but you don't. What's interesting is that you see a more critical engagement of news and information in China, because people know that they're dealing with a system that might not always tell them um, the truth, and as a result, they actively seek other sources of information
Mm.
to create a more critical perspective. I don't think that happens as much here, because I don't think people widely I don't think there's a broad perception of how much censorship and spin takes place in universities,
Mm.
in corporations, in the U.S. government, um, state government, so forth and so on.
I think that's actually a very important point, because I'm just kind of thinking about myself when I was when I was becoming sympathetic to China. I started watching CGTN and some of their news agencies because of that reason that you just gave. I was like, okay, there has to be. I know that my government and my media is lying to me in some way, shape, or form. Not totally sure where. So I'm just going to look at other media from other countries and just kind of compare and contrast. Um, but as you said, I don't think that is probably a very small percentage of Americans who go out of their way to do that kind of thing. So I think that's very interesting that you're saying in China, because at least, I mean, okay, so their government, yeah, they understand it could be not telling them the entire story or all the facts, but their government is somewhat honest that there is a, if we want to call it a firewall or something of this sort, where ours, it's a little more, yeah, we have freedom of speech, but it's very sinister and kind of behind the scenes as far as how they control like the information, or and they won't,
The point here that one has to come back to is that the party in China wants to have a monopoly on power, without a doubt. Okay, there's no ambiguity about this.
Yeah.
But they understand that in order to maintain that monopoly, they have to deliver results, which means they have to take responsibility for problems.
Yeah, that's a big part of leadership.
Which means that what they do better work and better correspond to reality, right? In other words, if I'm telling you that I'm taking care of all these problems, but you're actually hungry or suffering from disease or floods or whatever, you're not going to believe me, and you're going to turn against me, right? And China is one of the few party state systems, single party state systems, that has been able to radically adapt itself to meet new crises. And this is one of the reasons I theorize that it's crisis seeking. That it had to, if you look at the early version of the party that was influenced by Moscow, it had to radically change itself to save itself. It was being destroyed. It was almost destroyed in 27 and 28, and then again with the encirclement campaigns from the Kuomintang. And it had to take it radically adapted itself with Mao Zedong during the Long March and in the Yan'an period. And then, we have these new adaptations that follow that, so hard for certain people to deal with because they want to attach themselves romantically or, pathologically. They have sort of an identity construction that says, okay, I'm a Maoist, and that means, I hate capitalism and I hate Deng Xiaoping and yada yada. But look at what China did. They raised 700 people out of poverty, right?
700 million, yeah.
Yeah, 700 million people out of poverty. That something like 70% of the people who've been removed from poverty globally in the last 40 years were Chinese people. Okay. And critics of China say, well, that's because they were so backward that they had a lot. Well, compare China's progress with that of India. Both countries, start off at relatively the same period of time. And how's that working out in India?
That's the best point. Yeah, because development doesn't just happen, as right-wing people like to argue against us. They seem to have that perception. Like development just happens if you're a poor country, which is just mind-boggling to me, because that's one of the biggest things that I want to see happen in the future is these countries develop. It doesn't just happen.
Right. And single-party states have advantages and disadvantages. And what you said to initiate this part of the conversation is that, increasingly people might be coming to the conclusion that there's something to the Chinese system. I think that this is a misguided conversation. I don't think that anyone in the United States should be looking to the Chinese example and saying, what can we learn from the Chinese system? And, how can we replicate that type of party or authoritarian system here to solve our problems? Nor do I think that we have to necessarily conclude that something like that is necessary, because, as we said earlier, in all likelihood, that would take a manifest as a form of fascism. Rather, the Chinese position is that organically you have to find solutions to your problems that fit your culture, your stage of development, your all of these factors, right? Um,
Yes, and I sorry, just to interrupt, like I get what you mean 100%. Like we don't want to copy the Chinese system. If anything, I think that should be the one takeaway. If we're gonna copy anything from them, it's not to copy, if that makes sense. Because we talked about how the troubles they had when they were using the Soviet style system and they had to find their own way. So like if we can learn anything in the West, I guess it's that we have to do it our own way as they did.
right, but the other thing is, I don't think we have to valorize
Mm,
authoritarianism.
mm,
In my heart of hearts, I'm really closer to the Gramsci Luxembourg school of bottom up Marxist democracy, and um, that is an idealization that's never been realized, and may never be realized. But I would hate to start with the idea that we need to build, you know, um, a top-down authoritarian system as the norm, even if it
mhm,
was, acculturated to the American experience. Um,
mhm.
yeah,
That makes sense. That makes sense. I
yeah,
can see that. Um, yeah, like I said, I think that covered a lot. I think we did hit like a lot of important points in there, though. Even though we got derailed, I like how we tend to still cover important stuff. Um, but yeah, so I mean, I think that covers it. I'm fine with closing out there, unless you had anything to add.
no, I've,
But
I've appreciated the chance to talk. I hope I didn't talk too much, and if we have future opportunities to chat or discuss other things, then let's consider them. Or if there are other four that you know of that might be interested in hearing me speak, let me know, or your listeners can communicate this in some way. Um, um, I'm on LinkedIn, and because this still works in Asia, and if anyone wants to connect with me in LinkedIn or dialogue with me in LinkedIn, they can find me by my full name, Joseph Josef Gregory Mahoney, Mahoney, and um, I tend to ignore trolls, but if someone is advancing a reasonable argument or conversation for or against something that I've raised, then I'm happy to respond.
awesome. Yeah, I would definitely love to see if some other channels reached out to you in the future, and got you on some of their shows as well. That would be amazing. I might send around a few feelers, that might be able to get that going. But yeah, we totally appreciate it. Yeah, I'd love to do this in the future. Like you said, maybe another topic of diving into a different topic would be cool. But yeah, so with that, we're going to close out this little series right here. So thanks everybody who's been listening, and we will catch you later. All right,
Y'all take
peace.
care.
Mhm. All right, and so that is going to be it for now of our series of interviews with Professor Mahoney on the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution. And I'll finish this out by saying that you can listen to the Crimson Flag on any major platform that hosts podcasts. And if you wish to support the show, you can check out our Patreon link, which is going to be in the description. So thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you later. All right, thanks.